The spring of 1975 came late to western Iowa. Snow lingered in the ditch lines longer than usual, and the ground stayed frozen well into March. But by early April, when the frost finally broke and the black soil began to dry, tractors started appearing in fields all across Story County. Most of them were bright green, fresh from the dealership, still wearing that new paint smell. John Deere had just released their 4030 model, a turbocharged beast with over 100 horsepower and a price tag north of $28,000. For farmers who'd spent the last 5 years watching grain prices climb to heights nobody thought possible, $28,000 didn't seem like much. Corn was trading at $3.50 a bushel. Soybeans had touched $12. The federal government was telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row, that the world needed American grain, that this was the new normal. So they bought the tractors, they signed the papers, and they told themselves they were investing in the future. Harold Jensen told himself something different. He told himself he was going to keep farming with a tractor older than most of the men driving those new John Deeres. His 1948 Farmall M sat in the same shed where his father had parked it 27 years earlier, after paying it off in full with cash from 3 good corn harvests. The tractor was red, faded now to something closer to rust, with worn pedals and a seat that had been reupholstered twice. It had no cab, no radio, no power steering. Starting it on cold mornings required a specific sequence of throttle adjustments and patient cranking that Harold had learned as a boy. The engine burned oil, the hydraulics leaked, but it ran, and it was paid for. Harold farmed 320 acres, all of it owned free and clear. His father had bought the land in 1946, right after coming home from the war, paying $16,000 for what had been considered marginal ground, too rolling for efficient cultivation, too far from town to be worth much. Over the next 30 years, that land had appreciated to roughly $1,200 an acre. But Harold had never borrowed against it. Not during the tight years in the 50s when commodity prices collapsed. Not during the 60s when his neighbors were adding acreage and buying bigger equipment. Not even now, when every banker in the county was practically begging farmers to leverage their equity and expand. His neighbors thought he was behind the times. Some of them said it to his face. The Hendrickson brothers, who farmed the section north of Harold's place, had just bought 2 new 4030s and were renting another 800 acres at $60 per acre cash rent. They told Harold he was leaving money on the table, that with land prices rising 10% a year and grain prices at record highs, a man would be a fool not to borrow and expand. They showed him the math. With corn at $3.50 and yields pushing 140 bushels per acre, a good farmer could gross nearly $500 per acre. Even after paying rent, inputs, and equipment costs, there was real money to be made. And if land kept appreciating, the equity gains alone would justify the debt. Harold listened. He nodded. And then he went back to his 320 acres and his 27-year-old tractor. He didn't argue with his neighbors because he understood their reasoning. They weren't reckless men. They were responding to what every expert was telling them, what every government official was promising, what every agricultural economist was forecasting. The 70s were supposed to be different. The old boom and bust cycle was over. The world population was exploding. The Soviet Union needed American wheat. China was opening up. Demand would stay strong. Prices would stay high. Borrow now, expand now, because the opportunity wouldn't last forever. But Harold remembered things his neighbors seemed to have forgotten. He remembered 1952, when corn dropped to $1.40, and his father had to take a winter job at the feed mill just to keep the farm. He remembered drought years and wet years and years when prices were good but yields were terrible, and years when yields were great but prices fell through the floor. He remembered his father saying that the only thing a farmer could truly count on was the land itself, and only if he owned it outright. So while his neighbors signed loan papers and took delivery of new equipment, Harold kept farming the way his father had taught him. He used his '48 Farmall to pull a 4-row planter that was nearly as old as the tractor. He cultivated with toolbar equipment that required multiple passes. He harvested with a pull-type combine that needed constant adjustment and couldn't handle the capacity of the newer self-propelled models. His operation was smaller, slower, and less efficient by every modern measure. But his operating costs were a fraction of what his neighbors were carrying. He had no tractor payment, no equipment loans, no rent obligations. His annual expenses consisted of seed, fertilizer, fuel, repairs, and property taxes. In a good year, he could clear $30,000. In a bad year, he could break even, and he could sleep at night. 1975 was a good year. Corn prices held strong through harvest. Harold's yields came in at 132 bushels per acre, slightly below the county average, but respectable for his rolling ground. He grossed just over $46,000 and netted $31,000 after expenses. The Hendrickson brothers, farming nearly 3 times his acreage with their new equipment, grossed $170,000. They talked about their success at the grain elevator, at the co-op, at church. They talked about expansion plans, about maybe buying some of the ground they were renting, about upgrading to an even bigger combine next year. Harold congratulated them. And he used his $31,000 to pay off the last $1,200 on a loan he'd taken 5 years earlier to build a new machine shed, then put the rest in certificates of deposit at the local bank. 1976 looked a lot like '75. Strong prices, decent yields, another solid profit. Harold banked most of it. His neighbors expanded again. 1977 started the same way, but by harvest something had shifted. Grain prices had softened, not collapsed, just softened. Corn was down to $2.20 a bushel. Soybeans were at $6.50. Still profitable, everyone said, just not as profitable. The Hendrickson brothers had an excellent crop, their best yields ever, but when they did the math, their margin had shrunk considerably. The rent they'd agreed to pay was based on $3 corn. At $2.20, those acres weren't penciling out quite the same way. Still, land prices were holding. The equity was still building. Everything would be fine. 1978 brought more of the same. Prices drifted lower. $2 for corn, $6 even for beans. Yields stayed good, but margins kept tightening. Farmers who'd borrowed heavily started feeling the squeeze. Their operating loans came due in the spring, and the banks wanted to see the numbers before extending new credit. Some farmers had to sell grain at harvest just to make payments, even though they knew prices might improve by spring. Harold still had no debt. He adjusted his spending, put less in the bank, made do with the equipment he had. He netted $18,000 that year, his lowest since '72, but he didn't owe anyone a dime. 1979 was when the optimism started to crack. Corn was at $1.80, beans at $5.50. The Hendrickson brothers sat down with their accountant and realized they were losing money on their rented acres. Their equipment payments were eating up most of what they made on their owned land. They talked to their banker about restructuring, about converting some short-term operating debt to longer-term notes. The banker was accommodating. Everyone assumed prices would recover. They always had before. But then came 1980. Not just low prices now, but high interest rates. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight inflation, had pushed the prime rate above 20%. Agricultural loans that had been written at 8 or 9% were being renewed at 15, 16, 17%. A farmer carrying $200,000 in debt was suddenly facing $30,000 a year in interest alone before paying down a single dollar of principal. The math stopped working. All across the Midwest, Farmers who'd expanded in the mid-70s found themselves trapped. Their land was worth less than what they'd paid for it. Their equipment had depreciated faster than they'd anticipated. Their crop income couldn't cover their debt service, and the banks, which had been so eager to lend money 5 years earlier, were now demanding payment. The Hendrickson brothers lasted until the spring of 1982. They tried everything. They sold equipment at auction, taking pennies on the dollar for tractors that still had outstanding loans. They gave up their rented acres, walking away from deposits and prepaid rent. They worked with the bank to refinance, to extend terms, to find any way to keep farming. But the numbers were the numbers. When corn dropped to $1.50 and the bank called their notes, they had no choice. The farm their grandfather had homesteaded in 1894 went to auction on a cold morning in March. The land sold for $900 an acre, enough to almost cover what the bank was owed, but not enough to leave anything for the family. The equipment sold for less than half its purchase price. The Hendrickson brothers walked away from farming. One of them took a job at a factory in Des Moines. The other moved to Omaha to work construction. Harold didn't attend the auction. He already knew what he'd see. Families standing in the cold, watching their lives get sold off piece by piece. Bankers trying to look sympathetic while they calculated how much they'd lose. Neighbors placing low bids, hoping to pick up bargains but feeling guilty about it. He'd seen it before during the 50s, and he'd see it again now. The crisis continued through 83 and 84. More auctions, more foreclosures, more families leaving land that had been farmed for generations. The newspapers called it the farm crisis. Economists debated what had gone wrong. Politicians promised relief. But for the men and women losing their farms, the cause was obvious. They'd believed the story they'd been told. That expansion was the path to prosperity. That debt was a tool for growth. That prices would stay high and land values would keep rising. They'd been wrong. And now they were paying for it. Harold kept farming. His 48 Farmall kept running. He nursed it through breakdowns and repairs, replacing parts when he had to, rebuilding components when he could. The tractor was 36 years old by 1984, an antique by any standard, but it didn't carry a note. Neither did his land. When corn hit $1.35 in the fall of '84, Harold broke even for the year. Some of his neighbors went bankrupt at the same price. By 1985, the worst seemed to be over. Prices stabilized. Interest rates began to fall. The farmers who'd survived started to recover. Harold had survived because he'd never put himself at risk. He'd farmed conservatively when everyone else was farming aggressively. He'd resisted expansion when expansion seemed like the smart move. He'd kept his old equipment when new equipment seemed like the key to success. And he'd kept his land, all 320 acres, free and clear. In 1993, 45 years after his father bought that Farmall M, Harold finally retired the tractor. It wasn't broken. It still ran. But parts were getting harder to find, and Harold wasn't getting any younger. He bought a used John Deere, a 4040 model from the early '80s that someone else had traded in after the crisis. It was 15 years newer than the Farmall and came with a cab and air conditioning. It cost him $18,000, which he paid in cash. The Farmall went into the shed, parked in the same spot where it had sat for nearly 50 years. Harold couldn't bring himself to sell it. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons, he'd go out to the shed and just look at it. That tractor had planted and harvested more than 40 crops. It had survived 2 recessions, multiple droughts, and one of the worst financial crises in agricultural history. It had never made him rich, but it had never made him poor. It had done exactly what a tractor was supposed to do. It had helped him farm. The lessons from those years weren't complicated. Harold understood them because he'd lived them. Debt magnifies everything. In good times, it magnifies gains. In bad times, it magnifies losses. The farmers who'd borrowed heavily in the '70s made more money than Harold when prices were high. But they lost everything when prices fell. Harold made less in the boom, but he survived the bust. And survival, in farming, is its own form of success. He also understood that expert opinion and conventional wisdom are not the same as truth. In 1975, every expert said to expand, every banker said to borrow, every economist said prices would stay high. They were all wrong, not because they were dishonest, but because they were human. They looked at recent trends and assumed those trends would continue. They built models based on what had happened and assumed they could predict what would happen next. They couldn't. No one can. The future is uncertain, especially in agriculture, and the farmers who acknowledged that uncertainty were the ones who positioned themselves to survive it. Harold also knew that efficiency isn't always what it seems. His operation was inefficient by modern standards. He farmed fewer acres with older equipment. His yields were slightly lower. His per-acre costs were sometimes higher, but his total financial exposure was minimal. He had no leverage, no fixed obligations, no debt service. That gave him flexibility that more efficient operations didn't have. When prices fell, he could adjust. He could farm at a loss for a year or two if he had to. His highly efficient neighbors, carrying massive debt loads, couldn't. One bad year could destroy them. And it did. The story of Harold and his Farmall isn't a story about being anti-progress or anti-technology. Harold eventually upgraded his equipment. He adopted new practices when they made sense. He wasn't opposed to change. But he understood that new and improved aren't the same thing. A new tractor could plant faster and harvest more efficiently. But if that tractor came with a payment that could bankrupt the farm, was it really an improvement? 1,000 acres sounded better than 300. But if farming 1,000 acres required debt that eliminated all margin for error, was it really better? Harold chose to define success differently than his neighbors. They measured success by gross revenue and acreage farmed. He measured it by whether he could sleep at night and whether he'd still be farming in 10 years. Both measures were valid, but only one proved sustainable during the crisis. By the time Harold retired in 2006, his 320 acres were worth nearly $1 million. He sold the land to a young farmer who was willing to pay cash, a rarity in modern agriculture. The money went into investments that would provide income for Harold and his wife for the rest of their lives. They lived comfortably, not extravagantly, in the same farmhouse where Harold had grown up. The Farmall stayed in the shed. The new owner of the land offered to buy it as part of the deal, said he'd like to restore it, maybe use it in parades or farm shows. Harold thought about it for a while, then declined. The tractor had saved his farm. Seemed like the least he could do was let it rest. This story raises questions that extend far beyond a single farm in Iowa. How do we distinguish between reasonable optimism and dangerous overconfidence? When everyone around us is making the same choice, taking the same risk, following the same path, how do we know if they're right or if we're simply witnessing a collective delusion? What does it mean to be prudent in a world that celebrates boldness? What does it mean to be patient in a world that rewards speed? The farmers who expanded in the 70s weren't fools. They were responding to real opportunities and real incentives. The banks that lent them money weren't predatory. They were following standard practices based on reasonable assumptions. The experts who encouraged expansion weren't corrupt. They genuinely believed what they were saying. And yet thousands of farms were lost. Families were destroyed. Communities were devastated, all because people believed a story about the future that turned out to be wrong. Harold survived because he didn't believe the story, or maybe because he remembered older stories, stories about boom and bust, about pride before the fall, about the dangers of debt. He'd heard his father tell those stories. He'd seen the evidence in empty farmsteads and abandoned equipment. And when the experts of his own era told him the old stories didn't apply anymore, that this time was different, he chose to believe the evidence of history over the promises of progress. Was he right to do that? Or was he simply lucky? If the boom had continued, if prices had stayed high, if the experts had been correct, Harold would have missed out on tremendous gains. His neighbors would have become wealthy. He would have remained comfortable but not rich. Would that have made his caution foolish? Or would it still have been the prudent choice, just one that happened to carry an opportunity cost? These aren't easy questions. They require us to think about risk and reward, about the difference between intelligence and wisdom, about whether the outcomes we experience are the result of our choices or simply the result of circumstances beyond our control. They require us to acknowledge that sometimes the people who succeed do so not because they were smarter or worked harder, but because they were positioned to survive when things went wrong. And things always, eventually, go wrong. The challenge is being ready when they do.